The plane lifted off, piercing through thick clouds as passengers reclined their seats and scrolled through their phones. Victoria gazed out the window, pretending to ignore the glances that followed her since the confrontation. Diane hovered in the aisle nearby, her eyes darting towards seat 3A with simmering doubt. Why her, Diane thought. Victoria didn't look like someone who belonged in first class, at least not according to Diane's unspoken assumptions. Years of serving wealthy travelers had taught her to spot the usual crowd. Designer bags, loud conversations about investments, and a palpable sense of entitlement. But this woman was different. Unassuming, yet confident. Silent, but present. And Diane couldn't let it go. She moved down the aisle, stopping by Victoria again. "I need you to step out with me," Diane said, lowering her voice but keeping it firm. Passengers nearby exchanged curious glances. Victoria turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Diane's with a calm intensity. "If there's an issue, you can address it here," Victoria responded evenly. Diane's jaw tightened. "It's a private matter," she insisted. The man in 4A paused his movie, pretending not to listen. Across the aisle, an older woman shifted uncomfortably. Tension spread like a crack in glass. Victoria sighed, removed an earbud, and tilted her head slightly. "If there's something wrong with my ticket, please explain," she said. "Otherwise, I'd like to enjoy the flight." Diane's patience snapped. She grabbed Victoria's wrist, not violently, but firmly enough for everyone around to notice. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Victoria stiffened but didn't resist. Instead, she lifted her chin and locked eyes with Diane. "Let go," Victoria said softly. Diane released her grip as though burned. The passengers around them whispered, some discreetly recording with their phones. Victoria massaged her wrist and looked out the window again, her mind now far from the clouds. She thought of her late father's words. "The real test of power isn't how loudly you speak, it's how calmly you respond." Diane stormed toward the galley, cheeks flushed, ignoring the glances that followed her. The tension in the cabin thickened. No one knew exactly what was coming next, but everyone sensed it. This flight was no ordinary journey. Victoria's heart rate slowed as she reminded herself to stay composed. She didn't want this to become a spectacle, but she also knew with unsettling certainty that Diane Reynolds wasn't done yet. The cabin had settled into a muted hum, with passengers immersed in movies, books, or quiet conversations. But the tension from the earlier confrontation still hung in the air like static electricity. Diane Reynolds paced the galley, her mind racing. She'd dealt with difficult passengers before, but this was different. This woman, Victoria Steele, had challenged her authority with an unsettling calm. Diane glanced toward the first-class section and caught a glimpse of Victoria's profile against the window. The sight reignited her frustration. Meanwhile, Victoria sat motionless, eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the glass. Outwardly serene, she was acutely aware of the whispers around her. She could feel the weight of strangers' assumptions pressing against her back. Memories of past experiences flickered through her mind. The quiet skepticism, the second-guessing, the subtle cues that she didn't belong. The bracelet on her wrist, a gift from her father when she launched her first airline venture, felt heavier than usual. Diane's voice crackled through the intercom, announcing turbulence. Passengers dutifully buckled their seatbelts. In the galley, Diane pulled aside the younger attendant, Jessica Monroe. "Keep an eye on 3A, she muttered. Jessica hesitated but nodded. She had seen what happened earlier and knew this wasn't standard procedure. The plane jolted slightly, prompting nervous glances between passengers. Victoria braced herself against the armrest. Across the aisle, a man in a navy blazer glanced toward her, curiosity etched on his face. Moments later, Diane reappeared. She stood beside Victoria's seat, gripping the backrest of 2A. "Miss Steele," she said, her tone sharp, "please come with me." Victoria turned her head slowly. "For what purpose?" "We need to clarify a seating discrepancy." Victoria inhaled deeply. "There is no discrepancy," she said, voice steady. "And if you insist on continuing this, I'll need your name for my records." Diane's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me?" "No," Victoria replied, maintaining eye contact. "I'm asking you to follow standard protocol." Passengers around them grew still. Jessica Monroe, standing near the galley, clutched a tray, her knuckles whitening. The tension felt suffocating. Suddenly, Diane leaned in closer. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," she said softly. The words weren't overtly aggressive, but the implication was clear. Victoria's pulse quickened. Years of navigating corporate power struggles had taught her that confrontation rarely ended well, yet something inside her resisted backing down. The pilot's voice interrupted the standoff, announcing an expected arrival time. Diane straightened and walked away, but the battle lines were drawn. Victoria's fingers tapped against the armrest in a steady rhythm as she considered her next move. As the plane cruised through the clouds, the other passengers tried to return to their distractions, but curiosity kept pulling their eyes back to seat 3A. No one could guess what would happen next. Neither could Victoria, but she knew she wouldn't let herself be diminished. Not this time. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane cruised through the night sky, but tension kept the atmosphere sharp. Victoria Steele shifted in her seat, her mind running through possible scenarios. She had handled hostile boardrooms and skeptical investors, but this was different. The eyes on her now weren't those of seasoned executives. They were strangers who had made silent judgments within minutes. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Power isn't about noise, it's about presence. She straightened her back, instinctively adjusting the bracelet on her wrist. Across the aisle, a man with wire-rimmed glasses glanced away when she met his gaze. In the galley, Diane Reynolds leaned against the counter, her pulse drumming in her temples. The interaction with Victoria gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that this woman was testing her authority, mocking her competence without words. Diane prided herself on discipline, on knowing her passengers and maintaining control. But 3A had disrupted her usual rhythm. Jessica Monroe stood nearby, fiddling with a stack of plastic cups. "Diane," she said hesitantly, "are you sure about this? She showed you her ticket." "That woman," Diane snapped, "shouldn't be in first class." The statement hung in the air. Jessica bit her lip and nodded, though discomfort lingered in her expression. Victoria, meanwhile, felt her patience wearing thin. The persistent scrutiny and the unjustified requests stirred something deep inside her, something she usually kept buried beneath layers of corporate composure. She pulled out her phone and began typing a message to her executive assistant. "Flight 302, problematic staff interaction, documenting everything." As she hit send, Diane appeared again. "Miss Steele," Diane said, her voice low but strained, "we're going to have to ask you to move." Passengers nearby stopped pretending to watch their screens. Victoria lifted her gaze slowly. "On what grounds?" she asked. Diane hesitated. "Suspicious activity," she said, the words landing clumsily. "Suspicious activity?" Victoria repeated, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the low hum of the engines. "I've done nothing but sit in my assigned seat." "We can discuss it after landing," Diane said, shifting her stance. "But for now, I need you to comply." The tension peaked. A few rows back, a man whispered to his wife, "She hasn't done anything. This is ridiculous." Others exchanged uncertain glances. Jessica hovered nearby, her face pale. Victoria exhaled through her nose, calculating her response. She had options: escalate here or wait until the ground. "I'm not moving," she said finally. Diane opened her mouth to respond, but the cockpit intercom interrupted her. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice crackled through the cabin, "we've been informed of a situation in the first-class cabin. Please remain seated as we address the matter." The cabin collective held its breath. Diane paled. Victoria clenched the armrest. The realization hit them both simultaneously. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a spectacle, one that neither of them could control now, and somewhere, someone was recording it all. The engines hummed steadily as the plane carved through the night sky, but the tension in the cabin had thickened like a storm cloud. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking toward seat 3A where Victoria Steele sat, jaw clenched, staring out the window. Her reflection gazed back, calm and controlled, but the tightening in her chest betrayed the turmoil within. The weight of unspoken assumptions pressed against her. She adjusted the gold bracelet on her wrist, the cool metal grounding her in the moment. Diane Reynolds stood at the galley entrance, her fingers drumming against the metal surface. Her heart raced beneath her crisp uniform. Years of service had given her confidence in her authority, but tonight, doubt whispered in her ear. "This isn't right," she thought, but quickly dismissed it. She had made her decision, and stepping back now would mean admitting she was wrong. Jessica Monroe, the junior attendant, hovered nearby. "Diane," she said softly, "maybe we should just let it go." "No," Diane snapped. "She doesn't belong in that seat." The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Jessica's face tightened, but she didn't argue. Victoria's phone vibrated in her lap. A message from her assistant, Mark Evans. "We've flagged the incident. Waiting for your instructions." She typed back, "Document everything. No action yet." Her eyes flicked to the front of the cabin, where the captain had stepped out of the cockpit, his face etched with concern. Captain Ryan Matthews, a seasoned pilot with over 2 decades of experience, approached seat 3A. "Miss Steele," he said gently, his voice pitched low for discretion, "we've received reports of a disturbance. I need to verify your identity." Victoria reached into her bag, retrieved her passport and boarding pass, and handed them over without a word. Matthews examined the documents, his eyes widening slightly when he saw her name. Recognition flashed across his face. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, handing them back and stepping away. Diane, standing a few feet behind him, stiffened. "Captain?" she asked, voice taut. Matthews turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Her credentials are in order," he said evenly. "Please return to your duties." Diane's mouth opened and closed, the words she wanted to say evaporating into the tense cabin air. Passengers around them shifted, discomfort and curiosity mingling in their expressions. Victoria inhaled deeply, centering herself. The captain's intervention had eased the immediate pressure, but she knew the situation was far from over. The flight continued in uneasy silence. Diane retreated to the galley, gripping the counter until her knuckles turned white. The humiliation stung worse than turbulence. Her authority, her instinct, both questioned in front of passengers and crew. She couldn't let it go. Victoria closed her eyes and leaned back against the headrest, but rest eluded her. Her mind raced with calculations. This was more than a personal slight. It was a microcosm of a broader issue she had encountered time and time again. How many others face this? She thought. Her fingers traced the engraved initials on her bracelet. R.S., Robert Steele, her father. "Stay composed," she reminded herself. The plane shuddered slightly, shifting direction as it began its descent. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, announcing their approach. Victoria exhaled slowly. The ground would bring clarity and consequences. In the galley, Diane unlocked her phone with trembling fingers. A search bar appeared. She typed, "Victoria Steele, airline owner," and froze when the results loaded. Her breath caught in her throat as realization slammed into her like a rogue wave. Her pulse roared in her ears. She had made a catastrophic mistake. The landing gear extended with a mechanical groan. Victoria straightened in her seat, eyes on the illuminated cityscape below. Her phone vibrated once more. Mark's message flashed on the screen. "Ground team ready." She slid the phone into her bag and adjusted her bracelet one final time. The wheels touched down with a jarring thud and the cabin burst into soft applause. Victoria didn't join in. The real turbulence was just beginning. The wheels screeched against the runway, jolting the cabin with a force that made Victoria Steele grip the armrests. The hum of the engine softened as the plane slowed, but the tension remained, thick and unyielding. Passengers shifted, some stretching, others sneaking glances at seat 3A. Victoria adjusted the gold bracelet on her wrist and exhaled slowly. The flight had ended, but the confrontation was far from over. Diane Reynolds stood at the galley, eyes locked on the phone screen in her trembling hand. The search results confirmed what she'd feared. Victoria Steele was indeed the owner of the airline. A cold wave of dread washed over her. The consequences of her actions unraveled in her mind. Formal complaints, disciplinary hearings, and quite possibly termination. She tried to compose herself, smoothing her uniform and forcing her face into a neutral mask. The plane rolled toward the gate, the familiar ding signaling passengers to unbuckle. The collective rustling of seatbelts filled the cabin as travelers rose, gathering their belongings. Victoria remained seated, her gaze steady on the aisle ahead. She didn't need to rush. She knew the next steps were already in motion. A knock on the cockpit door drew Diane's attention. The captain opened it slightly, his eyes immediately seeking hers. "Diane, stay back," he said quietly. "Ground team's coming aboard." Her stomach dropped. "Ground team for what?" "You know what for," he replied, his tone devoid of sympathy. Victoria finally stood, smoothing her blazer and retrieving her handbag. As she stepped into the aisle, the passengers instinctively gave way. No one spoke, but the curiosity was palpable. The woman who had been questioned, humiliated, and doubted was now walking with measured steps toward the front of the cabin. Diane's heart raced as Victoria passed, their eyes meeting for a fleeting second. There was no malice in Victoria's gaze, just a calm, resolute finality. The cabin door opened. 2 uniformed ground staff members stepped in. "Miss Steele?" one asked politely. Victoria gave a slight nod. "Everything's ready," the staff member said, stepping aside to let her through. The buzz among the passengers intensified, smartphones tilted discreetly to capture the moment. Diane clutched the counter. "I didn't mean," she whispered to no one in particular. Victoria paused just before exiting. She turned slightly, scanning the cabin. Her eyes settled briefly on Diane. "The test of integrity isn't how we act when people are watching," she said, voice clear and steady. "It's how we treat people when we think no one is." With that, she stepped through the doorway. Diane felt her knees weaken. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, others averting their eyes. The hum of judgment filled the air. The realization that she'd become a cautionary tale settled like lead in her chest. Outside, Victoria walked toward the terminal, flanked by the ground team. Her phone vibrated. Mark's name appeared on the screen. "It's done," she answered. "Media inquiries are already coming in," Mark said. "Let them talk," she replied. "This isn't about publicity, it's about standards." Inside the plane, Diane stood frozen as the cabin emptied. The captain approached and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You'll need to talk to HR," he said softly. She nodded, tears pricking her eyes. I thought I was following protocol." "Protocol doesn't excuse judgment," the captain replied. "Go gather your things." Diane moved through the aisle like a ghost. The weight of her choices bore down with every step. The plane might have landed, but for her, the fall was just beginning. The terminal's fluorescent lights cast a pale glow as Victoria Steele stepped into the arrivals hall, flanked by the ground team. Her heels clicked softly against the polished tiles, each step deliberate. Passengers emerging from the jet bridge slowed, their eyes flickering with curiosity. Word of the incident had spread like wildfire through the cabin. Victoria's phone buzzed in her hand. "Mark Evans," the screen read. "I'm here," she answered without breaking stride. "Media requests are pouring in," Mark said. "Do you want me to draft a statement?" Victoria hesitated for a beat. "No statement yet. Let them speculate," she said. "I want internal protocols reviewed by morning." "Already on it," Mark confirmed. Victoria ended the call and pocketed the phone just as the double doors ahead opened automatically. Beyond them stood James Carter, the airline's senior operations manager. His expression, usually calm and affable, was tight with concern. He extended a hand. "Miss Steele," James greeted her, "the conference room is ready." "Good," she said. "Let's get this over with." As they walked through the administrative corridor, Victoria felt the weight of the situation settle deeper into her chest. This wasn't just about one flight attendant's behavior. It was about a culture that had gone unexamined for too long. Her father's voice surfaced in her memory. "The real work happens when no one's watching." Meanwhile, Diane Reynolds sat alone in the crew lounge, her uniform slightly rumpled, hands clasped between her knees. The reality of her actions hit with every passing second. 15 years of spotless service undone in a few short hours. A security officer stood near the door, not restraining her but present enough to make a point. "Miss Reynolds?" The voice startled her. She looked up to see James Carter in the doorway. "Come with me." The walk to the conference room was excruciating. Every step echoed like a countdown to her professional demise. When the door opened, she saw Victoria Steele seated at the head of the table. A manila folder lay before her. "Sit," Victoria instructed, gesturing to the chair across from her. Diane obeyed. "I reviewed the flight reports," Victoria began, voice even. "You repeatedly questioned a first-class passenger without cause. You escalated without evidence. And then you physically intervened." Diane opened her mouth to respond but stopped herself. Nothing she said would matter now. "What were you thinking?" Victoria asked, leaning forward slightly. I thought she didn't belong," Diane whispered, the words tasting like ash. Victoria's eyes softened, though her posture remained rigid. "That," she said after a pause, "is the problem." She slid the folder across the table. Diane's name was printed in bold letters across the top. "Effective immediately," Victoria continued. "You're dismissed from Mercer Airlines. This decision is final." Diane's vision blurred. The words seemed distant, yet sharp enough to cut. She rose on unsteady legs, nodded stiffly, and left the room without a word. The security officer followed. Victoria sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. The air felt thick. She didn't relish firing people. She never had. But some lessons required consequence. Her phone buzzed again. Another media inquiry. "Let them wait," she murmured, standing and leaving the room. Across the airport, Diane retrieved her belongings from a metal locker. The uniform she'd worn with pride for years now felt like a costume she had no right to wear. As she stepped outside into the crisp night air, her world shrank to the sound of her footsteps and the hollow ache of regret. The terminal lights blurred through unshed tears. The job was gone. The uniform was gone. And the certainty she'd once had about herself was gone too. The night air was crisp as Victoria Steele stepped outside the terminal, the weight of the evening pressing down on her shoulders. The polished glass facade reflected her image, poised yet weary. Her phone buzzed again. Mark's name flashed on the screen. She answered without hesitation. Yes? Media outlets are pushing harder for a statement, Mark said. The footage is viral. Let them run with it, Victoria replied, glancing toward the row of black SUVs waiting at the curb. The real story will surface soon enough. As she slid into the back seat, she pulled up the most shared video. The grainy clip showed Diane Reynolds gripping her wrist mid-flight, followed by Victoria's calm, measured response. Beneath the video, comments flooded in. Outrage, support, speculation. The narrative had escaped her control, but she had no intention of chasing it. The car glided through city streets toward Mercer Airlines headquarters. Victoria's mind churned with questions beyond the incident. How many others like Diane moved through the company unchecked? Where had the training protocols failed? The answers demanded action. Meanwhile, Diane sat in her car across the airport lot. The termination papers lay on the passenger seat, stark and undeniable. Her hand hovered over the ignition, but she couldn't turn the key. The words from the conference room looped in her head. That is the problem. The truth was impossible to ignore. She hadn't questioned Victoria because of protocol. She'd questioned her because of a deeply ingrained bias she hadn't dared confront. The shame burned hot. Victoria arrived at headquarters and walked directly to the operations floor. Mark met her with a tablet in hand. HR compiled a preliminary report, he said, handing it to her. She scanned the document, pausing at one section. Incidents of passenger profiling, 5 documented in the past 2 years. Victoria's jaw tightened. We should have caught this sooner, she said. We weren't looking, Mark admitted. Victoria handed back the tablet. Draft a training overhaul proposal. We start from scratch. Across the city, Diane parked in front of a modest apartment building. She sat motionless, phone in hand. An internal battle raged within her. Finally, she opened the browser and searched unconscious bias training. The first result promised practical tools for recognizing and addressing internal prejudices. With a deep breath, she clicked the link. The next morning, headlines swirled online. Airline CEO confronts discrimination mid-flight, one read. Another declared, passenger power, the moment that changed Mercer Airlines forever. Victoria saw the coverage while reviewing the new training guidelines Mark had sent. The media frenzy didn't matter, the internal shift did. Her phone rang. The caller ID read Dad. She answered with a small smile. Hey, Dad. Saw the news, Robert Steele said, voice gruff but warm. Proud of how you handled it. Thanks, she said, her chest tightening with emotion. It's not easy, he added. But you didn't just defend yourself. You set a standard. Victoria hung up and turned to the window. The city stretched before her, vast and unyielding. The flight had ended, but the journey to reshape the company was only beginning. She knew it would be a turbulent ride, but some flights were worth the turbulence. The sun crept over the horizon as Victoria Steele stood at her office window, the cityscape bathed in soft gold. She sipped her coffee, the events of the past 24 hours replaying in her mind. The footage, the confrontation, Diane's dismissal, it all felt surreal. Her phone vibrated. Mark's name appeared again. Mark, she answered, voice steady. Media's still buzzing, he reported. The training overhaul announcement got positive feedback. Good, Victoria replied. Let them see we're not just reacting, we're building something better. She ended the call and turned back to her desk. A small, unmarked envelope lay atop the neatly stacked papers. Frowning, she opened it. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. It showed the interior of a plane's first-class cabin, her cabin, Seat 3A. Scribbled on the back in sharp black ink were 4 words, Who really belongs here? Her breath caught. Her gaze darted toward the window, then the door. The air shifted around her, thick with invisible tension. The photo slipped from her fingers, landing face up on the desk. The grainy image stared back, mocking and enigmatic. The intercom crackled. Miss Steele, a visitor is here to see you, said her assistant. Who? She asked. He says you know him. Victoria's pulse quickened. Send him in. The door opened slowly. A man stepped inside, a familiar figure in a dark suit with graying hair and a composed expression. Hello, Victoria, Robert Steele said, his voice both comforting and unsettling. Dad? She whispered. He smiled faintly. You handled yourself well yesterday. She blinked. You sent the photo? He nodded. A reminder. You can't change a system unless you see it fully. Her mind raced. But why like this? Because the biggest threats aren't the loud ones, he said, stepping closer. They're the ones that sit quietly in first class, unnoticed. You exposed one yesterday. Now you know what you're up against. Victoria's heart pounded. So what now? Robert held out a folder. The names of employees flagged for similar behavior. This isn't just about one flight or one attendant, it's a pattern. She opened the folder. Familiar names appeared alongside incident reports she'd never seen. How did you get this? I never stopped watching, he said softly, not after I retired. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she closed the folder. And if I fail? You won't, Robert said, because you understand something now that few do. She met his gaze, searching for the answer. That power, he continued, doesn't sit in the seat itself. It lives in how you choose to use it. The city outside shimmered in the morning light. Victoria placed the folder on her desk and turned back to the window. The skyline stretched toward infinity, endless and unyielding. Behind her, Robert's footsteps retreated. The door clicked shut. Victoria picked up the Polaroid and held it to the light. The words on the back glowed faintly. She smiled slowly, knowingly. The system was broken, and now she knew exactly where the cracks were. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Mark. Victoria? He asked when she answered. Get the executive team together, she said, voice firm. We have work to do. Outside, the sun broke free of the horizon, flooding the city with relentless clarity. And in that moment, Victoria understood. The real turbulence had just begun. The clock on her desk clicked to 7 a.m. Her day, and her mission, was just getting started.